Thank you so much, Sudra. Jahan, thank you so much for inviting me. There's so much energy here. I'm so excited to be here. How many people are here from Lahore? Not many, but I'm thinking we should have a 042 disrupt. What do you guys think? Okay. Yeah. Jahan, you have to make it happen for us. Okay. So how is technology transforming learning? My name is Yasser Bashir. I run a company called Arbisoft, as Sudra told you. Why am I qualified to talk about this topic? And the short answer is I'm not. I'm a technologist. I've only practiced technology for the last 20 years. But purely by happenstance, it so happened that my company that's been building technology for the last 10 years, by chance, worked with some of the leading ed tech companies in the world. And so much so that education became our top vertical. And it's the #1 thing that we do right now. And we were also very fortunate that the education companies that we were working with were at different levels of education. So we have, for example, 10 Marks, which is a company that got acquired by Amazon 3 years ago. And they are in high schools in the US. So think of them as the paid version of Khan Academy. They help middle and high school kids learn their mathematics, core concepts of mathematics better by giving them very specialized assessments. Or there is McKinsey Academy, which is the learning arm of McKinsey & Company. They use McKinsey Academy, uses some of the platform that we built for them to provide training to McKinsey's customers. We are possibly the largest, second largest team in the world working on the Open edX platform. Open edX platform is a platform that powers edX.org, which some of you may know is the second largest MOOC in the world. How many people here know what MOOCs are? So MOOCs are massive online open courseware websites where you can go for free education and training. So edX is the second largest one. It has more than 10 million learners on it. And the Open edX platform powers 1,500 other such installations around the world where there's another 10 million learners, so more than 20 million people learn from edX. And finally, we work with MITx, which is MIT's Office of Digital Learning. So we have a pretty varied experience. edX is targeted to university graduates, McKinsey is for corporate learning, 10 Marks is for high school, and MIT is, obviously, you know, all know MIT. Oh, this is the older slide deck. Can we load the newer slide deck? Because there's a... Who's looking at the slide decks? Let me talk to you about that first slide. In fact, it's interesting. That's the reason I want the newer slide deck. I love frameworks. So when Jahan asked me to talk about learning and technology, I said, I have been working with all of these ed tech companies. I should be able to come up with my own framework. So 2 weeks ago, I came up with a framework called the 5 A's of how technology is impacting learning. And then I thought I should get expert advice on it. So I should talk to somebody who knows more than I do about this. And I did. I talked to my 12-year-old daughter. And she had a lot to say about it. She said there are a lot of ways in which technology is impacting learning, which these A's don't cover. So we ended up with this new slide deck where we have 6 A's of how technology impacts learning. And hopefully, now with the expert advice that I have, this is pretty comprehensive. So what are the 6 A's? The first one is access, but also accessibility. I know for many of you, there may not be a difference between access and accessibility, but for a technologist like myself, those are 2 completely different things. So we will talk about how technology is impacting access and accessibility. There's obviously analytics. Analytics is, in technology, analytics is one discipline which is impacting everything, but it definitely has a big impact on education as well. There's adaptivity. Once you have analytics, what do you do with those analytics? You basically adapt whatever learning content you're providing, whatever technology you're using for teaching, you adapt it to the learner's needs. There's acceptance of self-taught skills and learning. So that's my 4th A. We'll talk a little bit about that. Affordability is an obvious one, especially for higher education. I think technology has really lowered the bar in terms of what you can learn. And finally, there is connectedness. That's also an obvious one. There's a social side of learning, and that's covered in my 6th A, which is association. So this is my framework, and this is my framework. You can criticize it. Obviously, I'm not an expert. I'm not an educationist or an academician. But from technology's perspectives, these are the things that I think are important. So let's talk about each one of those. But before I talk about access, let me ask all of you a question. I think in the previous panel, somebody slightly commented on it as well. How many of today's jobs do you think are going to be eliminated by the year 2030? You can just throw a random number at me, like 10%, 50%, 30%. Any random guesses? Absolutely spot on. I'm surprised. Everybody knows. So yes, 50% of today's jobs are completely going to be eliminated by the year 2030. Why is that important? It's important because it means that graduates coming out of universities or people who are currently employed are going to need to learn new skills so that they can be employable. And is the traditional infrastructure really equipped to teach those new skills? I think it's not. Some of those new skills are really just coming out. Things like 3D printing or Internet of Things or machine learning or AI or robotics. Are the current universities and schools equipped to teach those skills at a very rapid pace? I think they're not. So all of these needs of the fourth industrial wave, how are they going to be met? And so my thesis is that digital learning is not only creating an impact, it is absolutely indispensable. Without it, you're not going to be able to learn the skills that you need to be employable in 10 years from now. So absolutely, access is hugely, hugely important. And it is going to be the way that you learn the skills that become the currency for employment 10 years from now. Good news is that access is increasing. Access to learning content is increasing, but access to the quality of that content is also increasing. So just to give you an example, a few people from my organization take courses with Scott Clemmer. So Scott is a UX god. He teaches UX at UCSD. 10 years ago, if you wanted an audience with Scott, you would have to pay maybe $100,000 in graduate fee, get an admission first in UCSD, and then maybe you could attend his classes. Now, most of what Scott teaches is available online. Most of it is free. You can pay to get credentials as well, but most of it is something you can easily access. Similarly, Sebastian Thrun, he teaches a course in AI that 120,000 people typically attend. And Sebastian is a guy who made Google's self-driving car. He's the professor of AI at Stanford. 10 years ago, you'd have to go through a lot of hoops to just get an audience with somebody like him. Not anymore. So the quality is also improving. But another important factor is that access is growing at a pace which is increasing as well. So interesting example, 3 of the largest MOOCs, I already explained for those of you who don't know what MOOCs are Coursera, edX, and Udacity. And combined, they have about 50 million learners around the world. Now, the MOOC movement really started in 2011, 2012. So it took them 5 years to reach out to 50 million learners. Compare that with radio, which took 50 years to reach out to 50 million learners. So the pace at which access is increasing is also growing up. Somebody mentioned, I think, I don't remember, I think Sam or somebody mentioned in the morning, Pokemon Go. How many days or months or years do you think it took Pokemon Go to reach out to 50 million users? Any ideas? Random guesses? 20 days. Yes, absolutely. So the access is increasing at an increasing pace. So that's the point about access. And the reasons for that are obvious. There's availability of devices, and I'm usually listening to a podcast when I'm driving to work. It's everywhere. So that's my first A. But accessibility, as I said, is a little bit different in technology's realm from access. So in my mind, accessibility means access would be you and I can both go to a website, and so we have access to it. But is it catering to the unique learning needs of both you and I? Maybe you have some special needs. Maybe there's some disability that it needs to cater to. Maybe you have or I have a hearing impairment. Maybe there's a sight issue. But not only that, not only physical impairment or disability. You could be in a place where there's not enough internet. The internet speed is really slow. Maybe you don't speak English as the first language and most of the content online is in English. So all of those things count as accessibility. And accessibility increases the pool of people who have access, and that's where technology again plays a very, very important role. Another way in which I think accessibility is important is making previously hard to understand learning content now easy to understand. And one of the best things, best examples of that I like is immersive technologies. So this is an image, for example, believe it or not, from the 90s from MIT's Media Lab, where two people are wearing headsets and collaboratively studying 3D anatomy, right? And imagine how accessible and different this is from learning about anatomy by opening a book. Imagine that your instructor is actually showing you on an actual 3D model, and all of the students in the classroom are looking at the same 3D model, and they're explaining anatomy to you. So that's an aspect of accessibility that's really important. This is one of my favorite VR immersive startups from Boston. They're called Renderware. They were the MIT 100K startup winner last year. They provide these headsets to senior people in old homes, where they can wear these headsets and basically just transport themselves anywhere in the world. They can see anything they want. And although it's not strictly a learning and education thing, the satisfaction level of these people increases by 50% by this one small gesture. And they obviously learn a lot more about the new places they're visiting as well. So this, again, I think is, in some ways, accessibility. Okay, analytics, one of my favorite topics. So analytics, again, I think has huge impact. If you look at this chart, this is an example from edX itself. This is just one chart showing the cumulative time that a certain video was watched by all of the students taking a course. The light blue part is the one where students watched the course just once, and the little bar on top is students who watched it again because they couldn't understand it. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that arrow there that you see. So that little kink showed to the professor who was teaching this course that almost everybody who was watching the video again would stop at that point, rewind, and then watch that part of the video again. So that's interesting, right? I mean, and he tried understanding why is that. Turns out he wasn't really explaining the concept that well. It's understandable. But imagine having access to this kinds of analytics to tailor the content. Obviously, he would have explained it very differently when he recorded the video again. Or look at this example, for example. This is again, big data analytics. I'm calling it big data because this is based on analytics of data from a large number of students. So typically in edX's case, maybe all 10 million of the students. This is an example of how long do you think a video for explaining a concept should be. Turns out that the sweet spot is 6 to 9 minutes. If it's less than 6 minutes, people stop paying attention. If it's more than 9 minutes, people stop paying attention. So for this particular course at least, it's a great indication for the professor that they need to explain the concept that they're explaining in between 6 to 9 minutes. So again, great example of big data analytics. But there's something to be said for small data analytics as well. And not a lot of people talk about small data these days. Everybody talks about big data. But small data in the case of educational analytics is about very specific analytics for, let's say, a learner. So in this case, for example, there's a graph of how somebody was involved taking the assessments in their learning, and then they just completely dropped out. And then several weeks later, they started watching the videos again, started taking the assessments again, and obviously there's a correlation between how much they watch and what their assessment scores are. And that's probably the time to reach out to them again. Each of these A's, by the way, I think, because this is an entrepreneurship conference, in my opinion, each of these A's is an opportunity. If you're wanting to be an ed tech company, which is, I think, a huge space, even in Pakistan, you should definitely look at which of these A's are we addressing. Okay. I still have 15 minutes. Good. So once you have all of those analytics, what do you do with those analytics? One of the things you do is you adapt your content. This, in my opinion, is the most important way in which technology is impacting education and learning. Because you could argue about all of the other A's that, maybe it was there in the traditional sense also. This one, I think, could not have been possible without the intervention of technology. So just to give you an example, I talked about 10 Marks, which is one of the companies that we work with. What they do is, their educators, their academicians have designed the assessments in a very clever way. So each of the correct answers, so this is for Common Core mathematics in the US, each of the correct answers obviously tells you what the student knows, but each of the incorrect answers tells you what deficiency did they have so that they chose that answer. What does that mean? It means that two people taking the same exam, same assessment, may end up with the same score, let's say 15 out of 30, but have completely different learning paths because they answered different questions differently and their answers point to different deficiencies. And this is exactly what they do. So after they take the assessment, all of the next assessments that you're going to get in 10 Marks apps are going to be based on what you don't know and you need to learn. And this is the adaptivity part. All of that analytics is allowing you to adapt. This may be easy for 10 or 15 or 20 students, but if you're doing this for, let's say, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 students, without the intervention of technology, this could not be possible. So that's my fourth A. My fifth A is acceptance. So this is a really interesting topic. For people who know what MOOCs are or online learning is, one of the biggest criticisms is the drop-off rate, right? So everybody says, yes, I can go and learn online, basically, 90% of the people drop off, so it cannot compare with brick and mortar education or whatnot. So in one way, education companies started addressing this by offering something called credentials. So credentials are like a degree, but they're offered online. And what they started noticing was that by offering these credentials, once the retention rates went really up, right? I mean, so from 10% they went to 30, 35%. People who are doing this online course or degree for a credential, for a little certificate, definitely remain more engaged. But also, acceptance started increasing a lot more. So at least 50% of the students who do an online course for credentials now list it on their LinkedIn profiles or on their resumes because employers are paying attention. So acceptance has gone up. Previously, if you went to an employer and told them that you taught yourself something by reading about it online, they probably wouldn't believe you. But now you have these credentials, and they make everything believable. There's extremely interesting biometrics to bring credibility also. So just to give you an example, there's something called typing DNA. How many people know what typing DNA means? Interesting. So yeah, it's a real technology. What they do is if you're starting a course, they'll make you type a paragraph. And turns out you have a unique way of typing which allows them, the technology, to identify 95% of the times whether you're actually the person who started the course or not. So when they give you an assessment, they can match your typing DNA with what you filled out initially and see if you're the person who actually took the assessment. So a lot of technological measures are also being put in place to create that credibility and that acceptance. So that's my fourth A. This one I wouldn't talk a lot about, association. I think everyone knows. I mean, there's access everywhere. We are in a connected world. Everything we do is, the rest of the world can comment on it. We can talk to them about it. It's interesting because how many people here know the concept of duplicate discoveries, for example? So a few hundred years ago, it turns out almost everything that humans were trying to research on was also being researched on somewhere else in some other silo. And there are famous examples of that. When Darwin almost finished writing Origin of Species, he learned that there's somebody called Alfred Wallace who's actually been researching the same thing, exact same thing. Leibniz and Newton famously were both trying to come up with calculus in their silos separately. In a connected world, this is going to happen less and less. So now, obviously, you can find out who else is there in the world who's doing the same thing that I am. It's easy to stand on the shoulders of others and advance the cause of education. Imagine somebody like Leibniz and somebody like Newton trying to solve different problems because they knew that the other person was already solving this problem. So association is another way in which technology has created an impact on learning in a big way. And finally, there's affordability. I think this is a kind of an obvious one. I mean, if you wanted to get a traditional master's degree from Georgia Tech, a 2 years master's degree, the cost would hover in the ballpark of $100,000, I guess, or slightly less or slightly more. But turns out today you can go to Udacity, sign up for a degree program, and you can actually get a Georgia Tech master's degree for $7,000, which is literally a fraction of what it would cost otherwise. These micro-credentials are also becoming very popular. Udacity has nano degrees, edX has micromasters, and they cost anywhere from $600 to $1,200, but they're extremely valuable. I don't know how many of you would know this, but Udacity's nano degree, which is a 4 to 6 month program, now comes with, in some cases, a job guarantee in the US. So if you've completed that nano degree and you don't get a job in the US, they will refund all of the money you paid to actually obtain that education. So again, it's deeply linked with credibility and credentials, and it's really changing the way people learn, these advanced concepts. And employers are taking note as well. I mean, this news came out maybe 3-4 weeks ago, but Google is now sponsoring 75,000 Udacity scholarships. These are ranging from, again, $500 to $1,200 in all of Europe. You can go take a course. And obviously, Google sees the need for web developers and Android developers who can complete this degree and go work for Google. And there are many, many examples of where people benefited from this technology and then ended up working for an organization like that. So anyway, I think I was originally told I have 15 minutes. Then I was told I have 30 minutes. So I've finished almost in 22 minutes. When I told my daughter about the 6 A's, and then I said, oh, you pointed out one A that I had missed out, so look, maybe this is comprehensive. She said, yes, this is pretty good now, but what about the dark side of technology? I mean, is technology impacting everything only in a positive way? And then I said, oh my God, now I have to come up with a completely different framework. So maybe next time I'm going to present a framework on the dark side of technology. Thank you.